Dunnottar, Summer 934. Constantine knew that Aethelstan was coming. Of course, fishermen had spread the news. Fast horses from monasteries had related up the country. Domnall had seen the ships flying from the south, and at the head of a moving army, refugees from villages and farms scattered by destruction. So when the horde of warriors, marching slowly and sedately, came from the west, from the direction of the only land crossing, at Stirling, and ships came down the Forth, he was ready. Dunnottar was reinforced. Owain, who had agreed an alliance with Constantine under his protectorate, had fixed his warriors to the inner palisade wall, Alba warriors on the ramparts. Constantine's father had fled, Osrith remembered, when he was fighting Harold Finehair. His son, Eric Haraldsson, had tried to reconvene his father's success in the east, but could not find a foothold, and rumour had it that he was considering the attack of Ofoik, so he could retake the Danish holdings there. And he had Anlaf. But there had been no sign of the Norsemen, who had returned to Man not a month before. Storms were said to be preventing the Norse from launching to march to help Constantine. Domnall was, Osrith had seen, been the commander of the warriors who had gone down to the waterline in order to confront the sailing fleet. It was their territory, they knew it, and Constantine did not. But, after a day's bombardment of Cymric longbows and shield walls, Dunnottar was put into siege defense, and Domnall was hurried back into the fortress with only 11 of the 100 warriors he had set out with. He looked defeated, Osrith considered, dashed by the loss of men. No doubt. She waited for a moment before going downstairs herself to speak to him, and her patience was rewarded. Engus clapped Domnall on the back, gave the prince the reassurance that a man, not a woman, could give, and she was heartened that not only Engus, but Phelim and Eswi all greeted him as he strode determinedly into the armory. Osrith had refused the keep, with the women and the children. Elasate almost cried with despair when Osrith had turned. But she told a woman, as she had told Edra, that she would not be a good companion. She would be frustrated, and complain and pace, which was not what was needed. I will soothe and give comfort, Edra told her mother. And she would, too. Edra had the way with people, and she knew that little Gisela, Stjora's daughter, would be in her lap, and she would tell her, and little Ragnar stories, Danish stories that she knew, or young Finan's stories, and keep up their spirits. There, Osrith heard Malcolm call, and pointed to the river. Where? Osrith replied. She had compromised in the fighting. Categorically had Constantine told her that she would not go out with Domnall, she would not be on the outer defences, nor with him in the forward defence of the fortress. It was true that she had not been able to see, but could see well enough. Now she had Bué with her, rescued, as it had been, along with tagged Sikhs, by Domnall, after the Lord Ealdred's attempted drowning of her in woad outside her barrack hall. Her eyesight had diminished, damaged by the caustic dye liquor, and while it was not as good as it had been, she could fight, and had proved it in the training that she had led, as she had always led, of the young striplings, Morma's sons, Lord's sons, who were training to be warriors. Constantine had passed few words when she had arrived. As Domnall crossed to him and explained the assault she had sustained, his impassive face clouded, as it used to do, when he was younger, his brows dipping, his eyes narrowing. But he had said nothing to her, asked her no questions, and Osrith had been allowed to stay, she too a refugee, as those poor, mean souls who had been streaming to their nearest fortress in need of succor. Edra had screamed at the sight of her mother, wrapped up in a blanket with no clothes of her own, and she mothered Osrith in return, fussing over her skin and hair, and had relented to take her to the armory to find her the clothes she liked, breeches and shirt, rather than a dress. Osrith had looked at the armory, now long clear of Sainid's belongings. How often had she sat on that bed, when a young girl, when a young woman, listening to the man who would become her husband, though for a short time. It had not been the now as Edra rifled through the clean garments, and Osrith then felt the passing of time, felt the years since she had dressed in Constantine's armor and fought in his stead, years since she had been brought in and bathed by Sainid, who had grown angry over her wounds sustained from her imprisonment and torture at Caligulid, on the instigation of Greogaire, false ally of Constantine who was vying for the Alba throne himself. She is pretending to see better than she does, and that she is not as injured as she is, Domnall had told Constantine, when Osric had left. He has reneged on his vow to keep her safe, and Constantine had agreed to him. The union of Osric and Finan was at an end, and he told Domnall that Osric would remain in safety at Dunnottar, once the fortress had been secured. And, safe meant that she was not to fight in the battle when Aethelstan brought it to their gates. But Malcolm had relented and allowed her a longbow, with which, at least, Osric could make some shots. She was not as good a shot as she might have been, for her eyesight was still giving her trouble after being stripped naked and nearly drowned in a barrel of woad. She leveled the longbow and pulled back the cord as far as her muscles would allow. "Your hair is still green," Edra had told her, just the day before. The dye was growing out, but the blue mixed with her fair, gold hair had made a green tinge, and she was tempted to cut it all off again. Osric shot, and hoped that the person who she had hit was no one she knew, and her thoughts drifted back to her hair again, which made her think of Finan. Had he been there when the commander of Aethelstan's army had shamed her? Was he down there, in the fighting? Had she just killed him? To the east, Domnall had not given up. It was he, only he, who could have returned to the fleet, organized the attack. Plumes of black smoke began to rise from the timbers. But Dunnottar fortress was having trouble as well, for the southern gate was being hammered by a tree trunk to break down its doors, and northern grown oak door was only just holding. A volley of arrows shot overhead, some at the tower, on which guards had been placed. They fell out of the sky like stones when they hit the shields of the Alba warriors out there on the parapet, and Osric turned and used one of their own arrows back at the England army. What would they do if they breached the walls? Osric had asked that question of Constantine. He had not replied right away. Treat, he told her, eventually. Treat and negotiate. But there would be war first, and to the front of the field where his forebears had fought, his father, his grandfather, his cousin, all, Constantine led the Alba and Strathclyde forces into shield wall combat, short swords high, lines holding until one got the advantage over the other. "Keep going," Malcolm called, and he stepped back, and turned to the rampart. "Hail downwards, quicker," he urged to the men throwing rocks and hurling arrows onto the barraging England forces. It was halting the hammering, but the door would not hold the assault. "Bring round your second faction," Osric told Malcolm. "Through the postern gate, and around. They need to be stopped." And, not waiting until he replied, began to hurry down the steps. "I can lead them," she called. "No," Malcolm called back, in a voice as clear and determined as his father, and it was as if Domnall was calling her that Osric turned. "You have no other," she told him. "You need to keep up the assault. Send me to take the second faction, the Mormers, the Strathclydians. I can handle it." But Malcolm put out a hand and hurried past her. "Owain can do it. You've taught him. We've seen what he can do in the past wars to our men," he told her. "Owain," he insisted. "Tell him, Osric, but you are not to go with them. Swear it." Osric swore. Owain, to whom she had taught a good deal, who had come with the Mormers, Engus and Phelim to Seaster to serve out her punishment in the Mercian army, had, indeed, battle experience. But would it be enough, especially when Owain had sworn to Aethelstan at Cirencester and bent the knee at Eagmont Bridge? Malcolm was trusting one who could turn his coat. And yet, when Osric had spoken to him, Owain had tried to kneel to her, too, in honor of her role as Gwaithilth, given to her by Prince Sindlin of Gwynedd, as their queen of the Old North. He told her that he had knelt outwardly to Aethelstan, only, that he too truly wanted the island of Britannia to be inhabited by only the ancient Brittonic tribes, and that Constantine's will to drive the Angles and the Saxons back into the sea was one he wholeheartedly agreed with. So, when Osric reached the king of the Strathclyde Cymric, he was at the gate, alert and ready. Clearly, it was a prearranged agreement, and the doors were unbolted, the Cymric waiting in the gap between the palisade wall and the ramparts until the door was closed behind them. And they charged at the outer gate, trusting that it would be flung open so they could exit at speed, which it was. Osrith gripped Bué, pacing between the rampart wall and the palisade, tension building in her arm, so much that she wanted to dash to the back of the line and add herself to the body of defensive warriors. Lady, called Maldub, one of the younger Mormers whom she had trained. Beside him, Sorley and Dodron, both of the islands, in a place once called Dulriata, their king an old man by the name of Gibleton. They nodded to Osrith, gaped to their back. Maldub, she nodded, and made as if to check that the rampart door was closed. But she was listening. Already the shriek cries of the Gales were filling the air, as Constantine led his men against the combined Mercian and West Saxon armies, rebranded now as they were as Englandish. Ethelstan's men, however, seemed to be doing well to hold their line, for, as she climbed back up to where she had been firing arrows, the line of assault had been moved back from the side of the fortress and back towards the Forth River. Constantine was winning, but that didn't make it easier to hear. Osrith's instinct was to follow, but her overriding thought was her mistake with Hywel, sharing too much with him at Amont Bridge, only for the king of Cymru to ally with Ethelstan. There was too much at stake. Her family, her Alba family, were either fighting for the existence of Dunnottar or the people within the fortress. She was Alba, she was the Gale Domhnall declared her to be. This was her home, and it was under attack. No, Utad, no, God no. Finan declared as they charged at the Alba shield wall. I'm begging ye, for any friendship ye have for me. For Utad had turned from the head-on battle and was taking young Finan by the arm. This was even more his home than it had been Osrith's, and his uncle sought passage inside. Finan watched them go for a second, and then followed away from the battlefield. For a moment, Finan wondered whether his son was playing a trick on them, but held his counsel as Utad took young Finan roughly by the arm. It was because the boy was unresisting that Finan felt a ploy, but instead his son led him towards higher ground. At the side was a raised ridge which seemed to lead inside underneath the earth, and he crouched down. Here, uncle, he told Utad, glancing to his father. The passage goes into the hillside and ends in chambers underneath the fortress. Unless the other gate is locked, Utad snarled. There is no lock, only a small gap through which to climb through, and his face broke into a smile. We used to climb through here, down from the Pictish stones, Selark Edra and Malcolm and Ildub, he told them. Selark and Malcolm were supposed to be looking after us, and we went to the river to swim, until, young Finan broke off and looked away for a moment. But it wasn't his hesitation over a memory that was cautioning Utad, and he gripped his nephew by the shoulder. And why should we trust what you tell us? Why should we not believe this is a trap? Why would I? Young Finan replied, not flinching at the anger in Utad's face at his answering back. My home is being assaulted by the warriors of the man you serve. It is in all our interests to bring it to an end. For his trouble, young Finan found himself pummeled to the bank of grass by Utad, and being glared at. For one, I so not serve Ethelstan, you shit-faced, Alba B. But perhaps that word was too much of a slander with Finan standing beside him, and he looked at his old friend. What say you, father, to this insolent prattling? I say, I will kill him if it is a trap, with your own father's sword, he growled, looking at young Finan's sword belt. So, he said, brightly, we'll be off, then, shall we? Lead the way, son. 88,888,888. Osrith did not know when she felt there was something wrong, something different about the battle that she could not participate in. Maybe because couldn't fight, and the urge to do so was overwhelming. Climbing to the top of the ramparts again, she stood where she had been firing down the longbow arrows. Malcolm was gone, probably with the support that was being offered down at the river, the Englaland army having trouble fighting uphill. At the back, the small band who had been sent, presumably by Aethelstan to attack the rear, had been stopped and were now being fought back down another bank of the hill. Lacerin, a Gale from Dol Riata, saw Osrith's face as she peered over, and placed a hand on her shoulder. Osrith shrugged him off, turning to see whose hand was on her, then stopped and gave the young man a wry smile. "'Tis nearly over," Lacerin told Osrith. "Look, King Constantine is coming back up the hill." And so he was. The gates were being opened and the warriors admitted as the few last skirmishers gave a latent surge of attacks before peeling off and joining Aethelstan's army in the valley surrounding the fortress. "You don't fight?" he asked her. "I do fight," Osrith replied. "The king instructed I remain behind, instructed that I fight from the rampart." "I understand," Lacerin told her. "It's what I told Odrin. It's what I told my sister Caerylane. Only men fight." At once, Osrith was on him, staring fiercely though her eyes were burning, gripping his mail shirt. "I fight, women fight," she told him. "You have heard of me, of a woman fighting?" Lacerin asked her. "Vaguely." "Sometimes." "You have heard of Osrith?" "She was a warrior. She fought beside King Domhnall, Malcolm's father. She slayed the Norse that were attacking, when the king killed Ivar Lothbrokson the Boneless." "You have heard of him?" Osrith was shaking the young man now by his mail, and he was reduced to dumbly nodding. "Yes, you will have heard of him, and how he treated your islands." Osrith relented, and loosed the boy, dropping back and casting a low glance at the incoming Gales, Picts, Strathclyde Cymric. "And then I fought the Minarian, and the Danes, and worked as a sellsword in Wessex, in Mercia." Her voice trailed off, as she looked down, looking for people she knew. Had Miral survived, she wondered. Had he been made to join back up with the main Englaland army when it had reached Berwick? Had Elfkin, Oshir, Falkbald, had Caltigar and had her Berwick warriors been in the press of men in Constantine's shield wall? She knew not. She knew not even where her brother and her husband were, and as to young Finan, after he had been used so shamelessly by Uhtred, the leader of the Englaland army. Aldred. If she found him. Osrith's eye caught sight of Lacerin's face. The boy looked shocked, and said nothing as Osrith stepped past him. There was a commotion in the courtyard. Oisin, another Gale, was arguing in Pictish with Phelim, who was trying to compel the Mormor to bring his men around. "Constantine is retreating," Oisin pointed out, forcefully. "Look here, you bastard incomer," Phelim began. "We are not opening the gates. We were under orders not to open there. But, it is Constantine," Oisin argued. "The king." "Let me go," Osrith said to Phelim. "Let me find out what is happening." And indeed, there was a clamour at the gates, a banging on them. Osrith climbed the wooden steps that led up to the ramparts. Behind her, Maldub was following her. "They need to come in," Maldub told her. "But we are following the orders of King Constantine." "Yes," Osrith agreed. "Do that, whatever he compelled you." And she hoped the stumble she took down the steps was lost in the general melee, her heart pounding as she realized that she missed Senid, the head of Constantine's household guard, calm, level-headed, kind, as courageous as any warrior could be. And the guilt that plagued her, often at night, when she was alone in what was once their bed, the guilt of not going back to see if he was alive, and, if he were dead, recover his remained, came to the fore of her mind. So Osrith knew nothing else that she could do but to head to the chapel. The banging on the postern was matched with the shouts from inside. Only the word of Constantine would compel the commander, Maldub, to open them. In the darkness at the side of the altar, listening to the noise outside, as she sat, Osrith heard another sound, too. The sound of voices, talking in English. 2. No, 3 voices, muffled, hard to make out. Osrith got up from where she was sitting, and listened to where they were coming from, her hand instinctively twitching towards her sword belt. Well, this was a thing. English voices coming from under her feet. What plot was this? So she stepped as lightly as she could towards the sound, and traced it with her feet, looking at the straw-strewn floor as the voices moved. Where were they? And, more importantly, what were they doing? The clamor outside seemed to have dulled a little. A decision must have been made. and she could hear the voices a little more clearly. They were underground, not too far away, and she wondered whether they had chanced on one of the old passages that ran in the hillside under Dunnottar. Chanced, or were shown. But who would have shown them? Osrith's answer came when, after patient trailing of the voices, which grew louder, figures appeared across the courtyard. 3 figures. But, with her eyesight, Osrith could make out nothing. She charged, passing all of the warriors standing between them, looking for the spaces between the bodies, holding Bué high. And Osrith was not surprised when her offensive was met with force, and she shrieked the cry of the Gales as her blade met another, one that she knew. Behind her, a cry came up, and warriors began in her support. But Osrith turned her head, as she was backed out of the alcove, for it was her brother whose sword, Serpent Breath, had met her own, and was forcing her back into the courtyard. "It is the king," a breathless Laceran called. "He and Ethelstan are in negotiation." But few heard, or took much notice, for, before them, Osrith of Berwick was sword to sword with Utad of Bibbenberg. "It would be you who compelled your nephew to turn traitor," Osrith told him, as she forced her heels into the cobbles. At no point was she about to let her brother pass, for he was likely to have a plan that unleashed the whole of the Englaland army through the earth and into the fortress. Behind the ramparts, a plume of smoke began to rise. "I only have to say the word, you are in my land now, brother." For she had made out Finan, with their son beside her. He had taken on Alba when they had married. He was Constantine's man, technically, and she knew that Finan would never risk breaking that oath in front of men who remembered hearing him say that. "There will be war," Utad told her, and began to lower Serpent Breath. Osrith, however, continued to hold Bué high. Utad had never given her any oath or promise, which made him as trustworthy as melting ice. "Constantine does not want bloodshed," she told him. "There are too many people on both sides who are dear to us, brother." "I will go." The words came from behind Utad, from the lips of young Finan. "I will go, and inform Athair that you have arrived." He made to step past Utad, but Finan caught his arm. "You will not. You will never return, my son." And Finan continued to hold the boy's arm, knowing, as Osrith knew, that all of Constantine's warriors had heard how young Finan had referred to Constantine. "It is because the king did not arrive at Cirencester, as arranged," Utad told her. "And he sends men to skirmish over the Northumbrian border." If King Constantine could have given more antagonism to Aethelstan, I can't think of it. "And yet, Minitsbra," Osrith shot back in Danish, "it is mighty convenient that you use my son as a ruse to get me out of Berwick. For that is what you were promised, were you not? Berwick?" At the immediate silence from Utad, Osrith knew it to be true. "Do you want me to kill the bastard?" A voice, in Gaelish, came to Osrith's ears. She turned, though she could barely make out who had called. "Oi Isom." "Maldub," came back the voice. Maldub of Stirling knew well of her brother, for he had been at Berwick the day that she had gone to Ofoik. "I owe him," replied, in Gaelish, giving Utad a foul look. "If there is any killing to be done of the Lord Utad, I will be doing it," Osrith said, emphasizing Utad's title insolently. But at that moment, more hammering came to the outer rampart door, and an arrow flew overhead, which hit the tower and fell to the floor. "It's Aethelstan," called Laceran, who was halfway up the palisade wall. "What does he want, Odrin?" The Islesgay looked out towards the rampart, and leaned over, to see what was happening as the hammering and pounding came again. "Come to ask nicely with his army of 20,000 if Constantine would humbly acquiesce to overlordship again." And thus it was. For the rampart gate was swung open, and a melee of Gales, Picts and Strathclydians surged through, and into the courtyard. Behind them, in a more sedate pace, the leader who had tried to drown Osrith was leading the Englaland troops. They stopped marching, and waited inside the gap between outer and inner Dunnottar walls, clearly following any agreement that had taken place. "Where is Constantine?" Osrith called. "Laceran." "Maldub." "Where is Constantine?" "Odomnol." "Engus." "Malcolm." "The king by the Lord God, sent Comsil appointed." of the line Alpin, Constantine and the king of the Angles and Saxons, Malda broke off and cleared his throat and spoke louder. The king who wishes to be known as Rex Totlus Britanniae, emphasizing Aethelstan's self-styled title, are without the walls of Dunnottar. They will fire another arrow when the negotiation is over. Osrith breathed. After war, peace, she thought. What else could Constantine do? He would not want more war, knowing that the supplies would run out and there would be much suffering on both sides, knowing that Aethelstan would wait out the siege, knowing, when she told him, that Utad had managed to find a way into the fortress through the ancient passageways. But, before she could think of anything else, she felt a hand on her arm. Buée fell to the floor as Utad pulled her from where she stood and darted up the unguarded steps to the southern side of the palisade wall. Quick-witted warriors who had seen what was going on tried to stop the Lord of Bibbenberg, but Utad parried them away, forcing Osrith up the steps in front of him, his blade to her throat. "Come on," Utad growled, as they got to the top. Up here, there were few Anglish warriors, and Osrith could see the cobbles, 50 feet below. "Come on, fight me, attack me. You deserve to, after all I've done to you." And when her brother let her free, she stepped back, looked down, as Aethelstan's army began to congregate. "If you are going to throw me off, do it now," Osrith told him. "Make it quick." But Utad stepped back. He looked shocked at her suggestion, although did not lower his sword. "Throw you off? Sister, I would have this hatred towards me end, for the sake of your husband, for the sake of your son." Osrith raised her head, looking at him, doubtfully. "You would side with Aethelstan to claim Berwick for your own?" she challenged again. "But I will never stand by and let that happen when there are families who have worked the land for centuries, centuries even before Anglish, before Saxon, before—" She broke off when Utad put her hand to her shoulder. "I want peace, sister," he told her. Osrith, he recognized. It was the first time he had ever said her name, and even then, Osrith couldn't quite believe it. "Edra was the name Jaitha, Gwaidhelth, gave to me," she told Utad. "That mother who loved you, who baptized you in the Irian church way, again, with Pika. And I gave it away, for I took a new name. I gave it to Thyra's daughter, who would have died had I not dragged her from her burning home. I took her." "No," she protested when Utad urged her to quieten, that there was no need. "No, I must tell you, brother," Osrith insisted. "That night, Alfred's funeral." "I know," Utad told her, and looked away. "You were only just recovering. I saw you at the chapel. And I left, and Thyra was alone, and I pulled her out. I took her to the Britons." "Yes, the same Briton healer who did all she could for Gisela." "No, Utad, you must listen to me," Osrith protested when her brother recoiled from her. "Gisela went there to practice her faith because the Britons could provide her with what she needed. Thyra too. But, it was too late, Utad," Osrith protested, her voice choking at the memory of that day. "I couldn't do enough to save your wife. So, I did what I could for the sister you grew up with. And Allah helped Thyra bear the child inside her. She had enough strength to do that." Osrith could say no more, do no more than stand in front of her brother, telling him all she had been longing to do, as if they were close, as if they were genuinely one another's family. "If it hadn't have been me, Edra would not be alive today. I fed her myself, I kept her alive, I brought her back to the only place I knew to be safe for her, here." "Here," Utad repeated. "Where you were safe, which you call home, which your son calls home." There was no judgment in his words, no accusation. But no approval either, merely facts. "Would Thyra approve?" Osrith asked, ignoring the tears in her own eyes. "Bika wouldn't," Utad replied, ignoring those in his own. "Bika," Osrith repeated. "I loved that man, as did you, I imagine. He kept me alive, from my Uncle Elfric. Our Uncle Elfric. He did the same for me." Utad shook his head. "The gods told me I had a sister, well, Bika told me." And he lowered his sword, and took a step to Osrith, and pulled her to him, his tears wetting her head, hers wetting his jerkin. It lasted for a moment, but it was the moment that they both needed. The past was done, over. But there was still the future to go, And one of those things in the future was the relationship that was going to be made between Aethelstan and Constantine. For the outer gates were now being opened and a small band of counselors for both kings came back through along with their respective king. Osric looked up towards the palace. "So your plan was thwarted, making my son tell you a way into Dunnottar," Osric told him, as they both looked down as Constantine and Aethelstan strode into the rampart area. "It was not for Aethelstan I got the boy to show me the way in, it was for you." "Me?" Osric was astounded. "How does breaking into Dunnottar help me?" "Because," Utad told her, "long have you suffered at my hand, either indirectly or," and here he shook his head. It was Osric's turn to hold up a hand. "It is done, over," she told him. "Let us not speak of such things, let us think of what is to come with our respective kings." "With your king," Utad told her. "And a lord I once swore to." "As did you." "I swore to his aunt, and could do nothing for Elfwin." In the end, Osric lamented, and looked back over the palisade wall. "I wonder what Constantine has had to give. I wonder how many men we've lost." But Osric realized Utad was staring at her. "Lost? This was no battle. Looked like one to me. I mean, this was no war. Aethelstan came in peace to the place he claims overlordship. He did not wish to take this fortress in strife. That's if he could take it anyway. It's better situated, better defended than Wibbenburg." He looked too, as Constantine strode to the inner wall, glanced up and then hammered on the gate. If he saw her, Osric thought, he made no gesture to it. Beside Aethelstan, stood the leader of his allied factions, and Osric was shocked to see that Owain of Strathclyde was beside him. Had the Strathclydians betrayed Constantine, then? Osric didn't think so. In fact, she saw this as Constantine's strategy in play. Have Owain play the loyal subjugate and pacify Hywel when it mattered,